Dear viewers, as you may all know, the presence of the armed forces of Ukraine inside the Russian Federation had been seriously diminished. There have been numerous false information around ever since that it is a crushing defeat of the Ukrainian forces, or it has been a bait for Putin that he may agree with the proposed ceasefire terms if the Ukrainians are removed from Russia. Well, as always, the truth is not black or white, it is grey, and not in 50 but in 500 shades. In this video, I will present you what is already known based on open sources, blended with my knowledge on tactical and operational level land forces operations. In this way, I hope that you will get a clearer picture about what has really happened. If you think my job worth it, please give this video a like or subscribe to my channel. If you have anything to add, I am more than happy to see it in the comments. And now, let's start. After the minor Ukrainian counterattacks in early February, the situation seems to be stable, but it was just a facade. The Ukrainians held their lines along terrain features which helped the defender. Built-up areas like Sverdlikovo, Malaya Lochnya, Cherkasskoye Parachnoye, Martinovka, and the suburbs of Sudzha were the main bastions. Between these bastions, significant water obstacles also helped the Ukrainians. The Malaya Lochnya and Lochnya rivers on the western flank, while the Psio River and its swampy floodplain on the eastern flank. Furthermore, on the Ukrainian right flank, the terrain was forested and hilly with only 3 passable valleys which canalized the movement of the attacker. Seemingly, these terrain features provided ideal circumstances for the Ukrainians, but the truth was far from ideal. Because the Ukrainians could not capture Korenyevo in late August and the Glushkovo rectangle in September 2024, their logistics relied on the N07 highway as main supply route. By the way, if you are interested in the events of those really dramatic battles in late summer 2024, I suggest you to check out my videos in this topic, link in the description. But what is more important, that this constraint, having only one main supply route, offered a huge advantage to the Russians. Their wire-guided FPV drones wreaked havoc on the Ukrainian supply route, destroying 30 up to 50% of vehicles moving to or from the Sudzha salient. To make matters worse, the Russians enjoyed a 5-to-1 superiority in numbers. They successfully managed to destroy the Ukrainian GPS jamming assets also, or they prevented deploying them at all by cutting the logistic ties. Either of it is true, the fact is that the Russians could deploy their glide bombs here with a somewhat larger success ratio than in other sections of the front. If we look back in time only 1 month, we can clearly see that there were Ukrainian claims back in February that the Russian drone activity makes the Sudzha salient practically untenable. This Ukrainian claim, and the Russian footages of drone attacks on the N07 highway in the same time, are the clear evidence that the Russians were preparing for this offensive for at least 1 month from now, which means that the Russian strategic level command decided to execute this operation well before the infamous Trump-Zelensky meeting in the Oval Office. I consider the last phase to be started in mid-February. Right after the Ukrainian attacks near Makhnovka and Cherkasskoye Konopelka on the 6th and 7th of February, the Russians, after 3 weeks of bitter fight, managed to gain a foothold in the important village of Sverdlikovo. In case of a salient like this, the attacker's intention is always to close the gap at the mouth of the salient. Therefore, Sverdlikovo was the southwestern bastion of the whole Sudzha salient. Both warring parties knew this, but after a bitter, week-long fight, the village had been captured by the Russians. But it seems that the Ukrainians had very strong intentions to hold the salient as long as they could. This is supported by the fact that they managed to stop the further Russian advance from Sverdlikovo towards Sudzha. Furthermore, elements of the Ukrainian 95th Air Assault Brigade, no bigger than a battalion, managed to masterfully utilize the terrain, and they had beaten back the repeated Russian attacks against Malaya Lochnya throughout the turn of February and March. But thanks to the relentless Russian drone and airstrikes, the logistics situation in the Ukrainian salient was slowly but surely deteriorating. All in all, the situation on the 5th of March seems to be stable, but now we see that it was far from it. The Ukrainians had serious problems with supplying their forces. According to the information of Tom Cooper, At some units, the Ukrainians even lost the communication with their superior formations. This is due to the fact that the Russians could discover and destroy the Ukrainian communication assets like radios and Starlink terminals, thanks to their superior electronic warfare capabilities. And the Ukrainians could not send the spare parts forward because of the overwhelming Russian drone activity. The situation was at the brink of collapse, and both sides knew it. As I mentioned earlier, the Russians managed to seriously threaten the Ukrainian salient to close its mouth by capturing Sverdlikova. Now it was the time to pull the noose tighter from the east. In the early morning on the 5th of March, after a short but intense fire preparation, Russian infantry assault groups managed to cross the Psio River with a force at least a platoon. They quickly gained a foothold, and while pushed onwards they provided security for the second echelon, and by the end of the day they penetrated the defenses of the Ukrainian 129th Territorial Defense Brigade in the vicinity of the village of Kurilovka, 2 kilometers deep and 1 kilometer wide. This success had been achieved by elements of the 177th Russian Naval Infantry Regiment, thanks to a serious Ukrainian debacle. What I mean under Ukrainian debacle? Well, if we have a closer look on the terrain, it is clear to be seen that in this area the attacker can easily move along only in three shallow valleys, as I mentioned before. This is the secondary supply route of the Ukrainians. Here are the Psiol and Sudzha rivers. The red line represents the line of contact, and here is the tiny village of Kurilovka. If the Ukrainian defenders' intention was to stop the Russians advancing towards their secondary supply route, their number one priority should have been to close the valleys with forces, technical obstacles, and combat outposts with interlocking fields of fire. Well, it seems something was wrong. I cannot highlight the fact enough that so far we don't have any video evidence from this operation, but from the tempo of the Russian advance, I can deduct the following. The Ukrainian fortifications were destroyed by the Russian fire preparation or had not been constructed properly. The forces defending the sector were also inadequate. This also can be the result of the Russian fire preparation, or the defense lines were thinly held originally. Therefore, the interlocking fields of fire, which is a fundamental element of defensive position, were also missing. Whatever is the reason, the Ukrainian defenses had been breached and the Russians managed to advance further in the valley on the next day. Because of the Russian aerial dominance, the Ukrainians were in no position to launch a counterattack or even to send reinforcements. So the Russians, with the help of additional glide bomb strikes, advanced further, and on the 7th of March they almost reached the secondary supply route. To make matters even worse, at the opposite side of the salient, the Russians captured the village of Lebedevka. This practically meant that the Russians overcame the last significant obstacle before the town of Sudzha and its agglomeration. The Ukrainian forces in the tip of the salient were in great danger. It was the last minute to commence their withdrawal. At the tip of the salient, a battalion of the 95th Air Assault Brigade was in a strong defensive battle position, and the southwestern shoulder of the salient was defended by the 501st Battalion of the 36th Marine Brigade. However, next to these powerful units, only territorial defense units and border guards were trying to hold the lines. If you have carefully observed my previous maps, I intentionally drew a battalion of the 61st Mechanized Infantry Brigade, but as it turned out to be, only its drone unit was present. The boots on the ground were under-trained and understaffed territorial defense units. It is no surprise that the following had happened. At the tip of the salient, the 95th Air Assault Brigade had beaten back the Russian attack from the west on the 6th of March, but at night, the Ukrainian on-scene commander, presumably a captain or a major, decided to withdraw its forces east of the Lochnia River. During this process, they lost a vehicle and approximately 4 soldiers to Russian drone strikes. In the same time, infantry assault groups of the Russian 83rd VDV Brigade and the 119th VDV Regiment attacked the thinly held Ukrainian lines near the villages of Novenke, and they also attacked towards Basivka. While the attack towards Novenke got beaten back by Ukrainian Marines, the attack towards Basivka was very successful. I mean very successful, because only the hastily deployed reinforcements of the 116th Territorial Defense Brigade managed to stop the Russians with the help of Ukrainian drone strikes. It seems that here the Russians got out of their electronic warfare protective umbrella. Whatever is the case, on the 8th of March it was clear that the Ukrainians have to withdraw their forces. It is the best to be done by retrograde operations, or so-called delaying action. It will mean that the Ukrainians beat back the subsequent Russian attack, then they withdraw their forces under the cover of own fire to the next defendable line, marked here as phase line Apple. Here, if they can't hold back the Russians, they break contact again and withdraw to phase line Blueberry, or even further. It always depends on the terrain. But on the 8th of March something unexpected happened. On this day, reports came that Russian infantry appeared northwest of Sudzha, near the natural gas pipeline station. Hence the Russian army is clearly unable to execute armored breakthroughs this large. They proved it several dozens of times in the last 3 years. This information meant that these units must have been arrived through the empty natural gas pipeline. And it turned out to be true. Volunteer fighters of the former 60th Assault Brigade, now simply called as Veteran PMC, went down into the only 1.4-meter wide tunnel, still not 100% clear from natural gas. According to Russian sources, some of them died from poisoning, while the luckier ones received gas masks and other protective gear. Sources are unclear regarding how many soldiers had been sent through this way. Numbers vary between 100 and 800. But in what the Russian sources agree, that approximately a third of them did not get out of the pipeline alive. This was truly an insanely heroic military action that achieved outstanding results that we will see later. Hats off to the self-sacrifice of the Russian soldiers here. Before we can go further with the events, please allow me just one question. According to my assessment, this is the fourth time when Russians use underground constructions to get into the back of the Ukrainian defenses on the surface. I mean, this Russian action should not come as a surprise, but they still manage to do that. I just simply ask, why? There are numerous ways to block a pipeline like this. It is clearly a result of poor planning from the Ukrainian side. Anyway, on the 8th of March it was clear that the Ukrainians cannot execute the retrograde operations as I described it before. Albeit, the Ukrainians tried to destroy the Russians coming from the tunnel mainly with artillery strikes. But the Russians still managed to hold their positions firmly, and they seriously hampered all movements northwest of Sudzha by occupying important junctions. On the same day in the morning, the Russians assaulted Malaya Lochnia from 3 sides, but they had been beaten back. But in the afternoon of the 8th of March, they captured the village without any further clashes. These events are crystal clear evidence of a successful delaying action executed by the battalion of the 95th Air Assault Brigade. In the same time, elements of the Ukrainian 78th Air Assault Brigade also broke contact and withdrew from Cherkasskoye Porechnoye. The Russians tried to inflict casualties by Nona self-propelled mortar strikes of the 11th VDV Brigade to the Ukrainian defenders in Martinovka, but here the Ukrainians held the line firmly. According to the blended sources, by the end of the 8th of March, the Ukrainian forces withdrew to this line, marked as phase line Audi. However, this withdrawal was far from perfect. The Ukrainians moved with great haste and mainly on foot. They lost at least one M1 Abrams tank, 2 Bradleys, and a couple of M113 APCs, next to a couple of dozens of dead and captured. According to my guesstimates, only this day the Ukrainians suffered a company worth of casualties altogether in the tip of the salient. But as always, the easy day was yesterday. The still overwhelming Russian drone superiority and the chaos caused by the Russian forces coming out from the gas pipeline had forced the Ukrainians to further withdraw to the southwest. On this day, the 1434th Akhmat Regiment captured Martinovka without any opposition. Events quite the contrary had happened in Kozacha Lochnia and Bogdanovka. Here, the advancing elements of the Russian 204th Chechen Regiment, also called as Akhmat, and the Russian Sturmoviks coming from the gas pipeline the day before clashed with the elements of the Ukrainian 95th Air Assault Brigade coming from Malaya Lochnia. We don't know any details from the events of this battle, only some footages of heavy Russian shelling and airstrikes are available. But what is fact, by the end of the 9th of March, the train station of Zazulevka had been captured by the Russians, while Bogdanovka and Kozacha Lochnia was still in Ukrainian hands. Before we could go further, I would like to draw your attention on another important perspective of this battle. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians extensively deployed their air forces, and no, not drones, but the real air force. This is a screen grab from a video that, according to Tom Cooper, presents Russian Ka-52 helicopters during a sortie in vicinity of the western part of Sudzha. For this video, I am extremely thankful to an excellent compatriot of mine, the Hungarian war correspondent Mr. Boldizsár Győri. He captured on camera a Ukrainian MiG-29 very close to Sudzha. And this is also his video representing Ukrainian Mi-24 attack helicopters flying towards the line of contact. These three footages mean to me that both warring parties concentrated all available forces into this operation, and the sunny weather made the deployment of air forces easier, while in the same time the life of the ground forces even more miserable. By the way, the link of Mr. Boldizsár Győri's articles in the topic are in the description. On the next day, the 10th of March, there were no pause in the battle. Russian recon drone observed Ukrainian infantry simply walking out from Russia through the border guard checkpoint, and the line of contact was moving too. According to available video footages and war correspondence sources, on the 10th of March the line of contact was running along the line marked as phase line Buick, but it was only a temporary situation. On the 11th of March, after the previous 2 days' heavy clashes, the last elements of the Ukrainian 95th Air Assault Brigade withdrew from Kozacha Lochnia, and infantry assault groups of the battered 155th Separate Guards Marine Infantry Brigade broke into the village, but clashes were still going on. In the afternoon, however, it seems that the Chechens coming from the northeast and the 11th VDV Brigade were much more successful. According to video footage, soldiers of the 1434th Akhmat Regiment were calmly walking inside the northeastern part of Sudzha. However, battle noise was clearly audible. On the 12th of March, the Russians reached the line what is still the active line of contact at the data cutoff day of this video, which is the 14th of March. There are still heavy clashes going on in Goncharovka and in the vicinity of Basivka. We still don't know 100% sure what had happened in the last days in the salient. We don't know about the casualty figures also. Russian official sources talk about 430 Ukrainian prisoners and thousands of dead. Ukrainian sources talk about a couple of dozens of casualties. According to open sources and calculations based on the laws and characteristics of land forces operations, I would say that the Ukrainians lost around 2 or 3 companies' worth of casualties altogether, which is far from the lies of Russian propaganda. Based on the very scarce sources, the summary of this week-long operation had looked something like this. The Russians managed to create the conditions for a successful offensive by months-long aerial and artillery preparations, and most importantly by gaining the advantage in the domain of electronic warfare. Thus, when they tried to close the mouth of the salient, however they did not achieve 100% success, but they still managed to force the Ukrainians to withdraw. On the second day of this very difficult operation, the Russians caused chaos by the assault groups appeared in the back of the Ukrainians. But, in spite of this insanely brave Russian action, the Ukrainian lines did not collapse, which is clearly represented by the fact that the important villages northeast of Sudzha fell only after the Russians advanced from the northeast and the Ukrainians defending here withdrew their remaining forces. As I said at the beginning of my video, this was not a total catastrophe of the Ukrainian forces, but it was far from being a perfectly carried out operation either. The Russians achieved an important victory here. They have captured more than 80% of the originally held Ukrainian Kursk salient, and what is most important, they recaptured the town of Sudzha. But the Ukrainian forces are far from destroyed in this region, which is clearly supported by the fact that actual battles are still going on west of Sudzha. Well, that is all what I wanted to say. Of course, later when more sources will be available, I may make another video in this topic. Thank you very much for everyone who watched until this part. If you think my job worth it, please give this video a like or subscribe to my channel. If you have anything to add, I am more than happy to see it in the comments. Thank you and see you soon.